Welcome back to another episode of the CyberVault. Today I'm excited to be joined by Kevin Haynes. Kevin is CEO of Reveal Security and has led some of the most forward-thinking security teams in the industry. At Reveal, he's tackling one of the fastest growing challenges in security today, and we're absolutely going to be unpacking this later in the episode. But to start with, Kevin, it's great to have you on. Why don't you introduce us to yourself and share a little bit more about who you are and what you've been up to?
Sure. Thank you, Katie. It's great to see you again. So I started, I'd say, a good long while ago in cybersecurity, mostly out of sort of an accidentally kind of getting my way into it and being so drawn to the mission. And, I had worked in technology my whole life, basically grew up working in tech companies. And I had never really felt mission until quite as sharply as when I first kind of got my first opportunity to work alongside and with a cybersecurity unit, and it was just it was the way I would describe it is people who would work on who would work whether or not you were paying them. I say it somewhat facetiously, but really, I mean, people that were showing up every day for the mission and there to make a difference and do good, and really saw it as a fight, in many ways of good versus evil, and wanted to do what they can to help. And all companies have missions and great things that they do to help the world. I just found that for cyber companies, it's just, for me at least, it just was really pointed and sharp, and it left an impression on me. And like I said, it was kind of an opportunity I didn't expect that came along, and then when I had that feeling, I didn't want to leave it. And so then I was like, okay, well, how do I do this more? How do I stay involved in this? And so I've done. Run large, very large SOCs around the world, and been involved in building out incident response teams and blue teams, and even helping to at one point try to solve the skills gap, or the lack of enough people sort of to do the jobs. Which back, that was back a while ago when. My biggest problem, was literally trying to just find enough people to come and fill the roles that we had. I think a lot of that's changed since then, but that was for a good bit of while, that was a passion project for me in terms of how do we get what seems like a broken system of some really great jobs, great paying jobs with this amazing mission, and then people who want good jobs and great jobs, but something sort of broken in the middle. And that became a passion of mine to really kind of help build something that could, help people obtain the skills, to go take those opportunities. And then now today, I'm so happy to be fighting the fight at Reveal Security. So that's sort of my background.
No, and I think kind of that sentiment you share, Kevin, has really been defined throughout your career. I mean, it's the reason we've got multiple connections, because of some of the people that you've been able to build and now are doing incredible things because they were given that opportunity. But I also think it's aligned to the kind of companies that you've worked for and the missions that you've served, really. And I think that's a huge thing in cyber. People can often forget that, it's a noisy space, but at the end of the day, you're actually a lot of the time just helping the everyday person from something that is actually pretty terrifying, can have such a negative impact on their life. And today we're going to unpack something that I think is one of the biggest topics in security right now. It's definitely a buzzword that we're hearing thrown around, and I think your experience and your knowledge in this space is probably going to help strip it back a little bit. And so to kind of start unpacking that then, Kevin, because let's really start at the basics, because I think we've mentioned this, but non-human identities has become a bit of a buzzword. And I think it's the same for so many of these different topics in security, whether you're looking at things like Gen AI or whatever it may be. But when we're looking at this kind of category and this particular, threat landscape, what are we really talking about here? Because I think the picture's much bigger than people quite realize.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I know, it comes up a lot for me as well in terms of I know it's an area of interest, non-human identities, right? And what kind of problem that's presenting. And I know that there's a lot of uh, thoughts about this and commentary about this as a growing problem, a massively growing problem. And so sort of starting first with what does this even mean? Because is this really new? Is it we've had identities since beginning of computing. So what is this? So it's we're talking about any kind of machine identity, an application, like a service, some sort of software component, or I think increasingly today we think of it as like automated services and so on that need to access. Um, need to access other systems, they need to access data and have some interaction with them. And so in order to do that, they have to authenticate, right? Just like we think of you or I needing to do something, and with data or with an application of some kind, and we need to authenticate, right? So it's sort of the same thing, right? It's just instead of you or I, a human doing it, it's a service, right? Where it's some machine doing that. And I think the basis of the growing concern is that, okay, well, it hasn't, it's been around a while, but like in terms of the number of these things, the volume of these things seems to be growing exponential. And now you sort of have AI enter the picture, right? And the ability to sort of spin these things up, and they sort of appear and disappear, and sort of the fluid nature of them, and the fact that they're now outnumbering, I think pretty. I don't know all the latest stats, but the last I saw, there's more of them than there are people, right? And so, like, yeah, it's a concern. It's why people are thinking about this. Like, okay, how do I defend this, right? And these things can be spun up. They have who knows what sort of privileges. They're going to be authenticating things that are going to be doing things with my data and my applications. How do I get my head around that? And I think my sort of caution there is, I think the answer is yes. It's a yes and for me, which is yes. We need to be we need to be worried about that, and we need to be thinking about it as yes, it's growing, which creates maybe more of an urgency. If we're not thinking about it already, maybe there's more urgency now to think about this. But I'd also just my caution is, I don't think you can separate this and think about it from human identities. I really think for the defender and the operator. So I'm an operator, come from sort of that. I always think about things as an operator. I would have a hard time trying to think about a whole ecosystem and tooling and processes and everything else, that sort of training and everything else that kind of goes along with that, and solve like only part of the machine, the non-human part of it, and then have a whole separate sort of stack and everything else for like what I'm doing with the human part of this.
Yeah.
And the human part of it's hard enough, right? Because you have you have people that you're sort of your employees, but you also have a lot of times people outside the organization, whether they may be customers or whatever, right? So it's a hard problem, and I think it needs to be thought of together, which is an identity problem.
Yeah.
And you really have to think about solving all that together, not just. And this is my only concern, Katie, which is I think there may be a little too much fixation on just the non-human part.
Yeah. And do you think then kind of the lack of potential synergy between the two, because I think you're 100% right in what you're saying there, they definitely go hand in hand. And and we'll go into it in a moment, but obviously there's groups that are targeting multiple different vulnerabilities, but this is definitely becoming a key threat landscape. But I suppose most companies probably don't even know how many of these vulnerabilities they have. I mean, do you think there's a reason why discovery could be quite hard, or is it because it's just quite new that kind of, that they don't necessarily realize that, human identities, non-human identities, or machine identities are both presenting this big problem and actually all need solving, probably in, I want to say, like conjunction together?
Yeah, that's a good. There's a
Loaded
lot in there.
question.
There's a lot in there to unpack. How long do we have, Katie? That's cool. Um, this this is a really big topic. I do think this is the good news, right? When we sort of unpack, I think the good news is that um, if we stand back and just talk, I think identity itself is becoming a much bigger sort of concern for people. And then inside of that, there's categories, right? There's like non-human, I think is a category of sort of the broader identity thing. And I do, as I'm talking to security leaders these days, and one of the things I love to hear about are what are the things that they're worried about, what's on their priority list, what can we help with, and identity, I'm happy to say, usually comes up pretty frequently and pretty high on the list. And so that's good, right? Because I think there is this awareness and urgency, and everything kind of starts there because, if it's not a priority, then, you're really not, you're just going to kick the can. But I think that's changing because of, I think we're learning more about how this is not just a perceived threat, but like a real one.
Yeah.
And nothing like you start to see it being used, so to speak. You mentioned about vulnerability. I mean, you start to see it being the identities being used in attacks in ways that are now getting a lot of publicity, and people are sort of deep diving that and providing. Um, Details that maybe we didn't have as much in the past, and I think that's helping, right? So I think identity is one in that. Again, back to how did this start? Well, it started with we've got to sort of have a way to to prevent who's coming in, and we thought about it a lot like we think about how we grew up in security, which is we got to keep the bad people out and like our good people in, right? And sort of the idea of the castle walls, right? I think now that's being challenged. That way of thinking about cybersecurity is being challenged because what if you can no longer trust that who people you can't trust that identity and what it and what it actually is behind that on the on the keyboard, so to speak, and then what that identity is fully able to do and authorized to do, and maybe completely doing it in a way that's going to hurt you. So that's, I think, a new dynamic, and I'm happy to say it's a big problem, and we can go into some of that. But I am, again, back to, I think people are aware, much more aware of this now.
Yeah, and I think we really started to see that at some of the conventions this year. I think RSA was probably one of the first kickoffs where identity was a big topic, where historically it's not always been on the forefront of not just kind of innovation when it comes to new products and stuff like that, but it's not always been the most talked about subject, despite it probably being one of the biggest vulnerabilities. And we've definitely kind of started to see that shift. And you mentioned there as well the publicity that's kind of starting to come out. I mean, if you look at groups like Scattered Spider, for example, that have consistently been making headlines, and I think that not only installs a little bit more fear into people, but I think it also kind of allows everyone to recognize it's not that playbook of, oh, yeah, it happens, but it just won't happen to us. People are kind of going, oh, actually, we're probably prime suspect because, maybe we're a small to medium kind of business, and probably they're expecting that we're going to have less implemented than, say, a large enterprise. I mean, how do you think attackers like this are starting to take advantage of the identity kind of landscape and using that as a way to kind of break in?
Yeah, I'll get back to that question. I want to sort of, there was something that you said that triggered a thought around sort of going back and, identity not being sort of, it's how we think of it over time. And yeah, I think it was, definitely was an IT thing, right? In terms of how do I get people, new joiners into the systems that they need, and get, people that are leaving out of the systems that I need, and do that as efficiently as possible and automated as possible, so that I'm spending as little as possible on, people, coming and going and changing and, access and all that stuff. And even today, it's interesting, like, where does identity really sit in the organization? I will tell you, I'm not advocating for this at all, but I will tell you, in many organizations, I do believe that it's still sort of an IT. They're still sort of not, not super clear. Is it the CISO responsibility? Is it the CIO IT responsibility? And I think there's some look that's getting better for sure, but I think there's still some um, remnants of sort of the legacy here of where it came from and where it sits and how it's thought about. Luckily, that's changing a lot. So, and then your question about sort of the threat actors and sort of what they're doing. Um, yeah, I mean, is it surprising? So if I said, hey, you know, you can go this path if Katie turned into a bad actor for a moment. I know you would never do that, but if you were, you turn into a bad actor for a moment and said, "Hey, Katie, you can go to this path, to your objective," and it's full of think of the movies where they have the laser beams and all the alarms and the alerts and the cameras and everything else is fully instrumented to catch you, right? You can go there to get your objective, or you can go over here where there's none of that, and no one will definitely catch you, and you can achieve your objective that way. So this is sort of what I think the identity is the new endpoint.
Yeah.
I mean, think about I love talking to my old red team friends, and one of them said to me not too long ago, like, why would I bother getting on the endpoint at this? Everybody has an agent, or multiple agents. Everybody has years of building up the sort of the telemetry off those endpoints, layers and layers of security. Yes, it's still possible. I'm not saying that. I've been around enough to know. Yes, a determined adversary can find a way, but you're going to have to do a lot of planning and prep. Usually, you have to think about that. And if I can show you an alternative where it's okay, you can bypass MFA, log into the applications, and you're pretty much not going to be seen. That sounds a little more attractive. So I think it's not surprising what we're seeing.
Yeah, for sure. And kind of, I think I also want to circle back on something that you said there as well, because when we're looking at one of the biggest things here, and potentially it's just, the mindset that the expectations that legacy security has kind of set. Obviously, this is probably one of the quickest evolving technology landscapes. Security, it doesn't matter what aspects you're looking at, is really being revolutionized, especially with the adoption of things like Gen AI and obviously machine identities and so on. But do you think it's potentially creating blockers for the defenders to really shift things so that it's kind of playing in their favor?
It's a good question. Okay, this is an interesting slice of technology, as you said, which is every day sort of there's groups of people who come in and try to figure out how to undo, and get around everything that's sort of there. That's kind of unique to cybersecurity versus other slices of technology, I think. And it creates this, like you said, it's, whether you like it or not, a very fast innovation loop that it's hard, right? This is hard. And I think, what you're taking something which is a problem, and now we're adding some complications to it. The problem is sort of, identity and this fast, and the complication is that when we use identity to sort of do harm, the whole way that we've sort of been built to think about, or programs have been built over time, has been built on sort of keeping the bad people outside the castle, right, and not letting them in, and we sort of defend that. And then then we have some people inside the castle who are sort of making sure that the people in the castle are not doing something too bad, right? But they're kind of different people, right? And we more or less trust the people inside the castle to do the right thing, and they're not sort of our enemy. And so you got to think over time. I mean, that is true, right? If you go back in time, and kind of think about the cybersecurity programs of I'll call them legacy up to now. You can absolutely see remnants of that. I mean, how many large organizations still have sort of a CISO, and then kind of call it audit or risk, and they kind of think sometimes don't. One's kind of looking at what insiders are doing if they're malicious, and then one's looking at kind of external type threats, and maybe they meet a little bit, but maybe not. And I think that's a material weakness that's being exposed now, right? And it's a hard thing because when there's an identity that's been given a token, right? This identity has gone through the whatever process, single sign-on or whatever. It's been authenticated. It has privileges and roles that it can do, right? And now it's like, okay, I have this I have this token. I now have access to all these doors, right? And I can go into any of them. I'm okay to I'm given the privilege to go into any of them and do what I have the access to do, right? And really, it's how do you understand that when it is intention of doing harm versus just coming in and doing what I normally do, right? So if someone were to take your credentials, Katie, and and it's not you, but they're just using your credentials to do to get into the applications and do stuff, they could probably just use the permissions and the access that you have to achieve their objective. They probably wouldn't have to do crazy different things, right? In terms of like beyond your escalating your privileges or whatever, and that's a hard thing, right? And so how do you separate sort of the malicious insider from the person from the outside who's wanting to do harm? And we're not really equipped. We've not been set up like that through time to sort of handle that kind of a problem, and it's sticky, right? Like, I mean, do I if I see Katie's identity doing something that looks like, okay, maybe this is not good, is that does that become a kind of an HR sort of like investigation about like what's going on with Katie right now, or is that somebody's taking over? And it's just a harder kind of thing, and this is why I'm talking about this as a problem that has lots of complications.
Yeah, and I think that's definitely probably one of like the biggest challenges to overcome here, because it's easy to forget that you're also dealing with people at the end of the day. It's literally like you say, that's a person there. Is it a HR problem? Is it a technology problem? And how do you make sure that you're remediating the risk basically as quick as possible? Because
Yeah,
at the same time, if it was then the individual, you also then don't want to have some kind of complication with that staff member if actually it would. It's one of those that where's the line, and kind of how do you walk? It's a bit of a balancing beam, really, isn't it?
yeah, it is. And I think we're going to have to get. I mean, I think organizations are maturing these processes and thinking about these challenges, and I think we will get better. But I'm just saying it's sort of like there's some divides here from a legacy perspective. And I will say too, the other thing I think makes this challenging, which is back to the fact that okay, we're dealing with an identity. It may very well be a machine, not a human.
Yeah,
um, and it's the same kind of thing though. That machine, that identity is going to have authenticated, and it will have permissions to do things, right? And what these identities, human or non, are doing is they're. I think a lot of our programs over time have been built up protecting the infrastructure.
yeah,
It's like, okay, I need to protect the infrastructure layer. And when you start talking about identities, you're now talking. I mean, it is the infrastructure layer, but you're also talking about the application layer, because
yeah,
what do humans and non-humans do? They interact with application layer, components, or products, and these are things that historically, in many cases, are business applications or business layer, logic, which becomes hard for the defender sometimes, because think about, like, I was on the soapbox some time ago talking about the Salesforce stuff, and really seeing a risk there, because without getting, I saw a risk there, and was going out and speaking about it, putting stuff on socials for people to look at this, and I was getting really crazy, crooked eyebrows, sort of. What are you talking about? Why would somebody want my CRM? And it's like, do you know what's in it?
yeah,
Um, because again, like, how many, just as an example, like, how many analysts, practitioners, sort of know the inner workings, ins and outs, and what is what is all the sort of business objects inside of like a CRM,
yeah,
right? And would be able to know that, okay, hey, something is amiss, right? And it's really so that adds a layer of complexity in terms of these threat actors. If without mentioning specific ones, it'll be pretty obvious probably who I'm talking about. But logging into the applications and using them for things like recon,
Yeah.
right? I mean, what's what's a great thing to do is go read all about a company's infrastructure, in
Yeah.
their whatever application they keep all their documentation about their infrastructure, right? Find out well what tools do they use, how what do they use for, how do they do single sign on, what does their service catalog look like, how does someone request access, where does that request go, what happened, like you can pretty much read all about that.
Yeah.
So like, yeah. So I think it's a really hard problem. And the good news is, it's starting to become, we're starting to see now, I would say irrefutable evidence that it's being used against us, and that sort of needs to raise it up on the priority list to now say, okay, yeah, we got to figure out how do we, if someone gets creds, and maybe they are a malicious insider, right? That's not good either. But if there's someone operating inside of our application layer, doing things that would harm our organization, how can we detect that and mitigate that?
Yeah, for sure. And I think kind of that's probably, if there's a sentiment to really take away from today, it's the fact that this is actually something that's critical. It needs looking at, but at least people are definitely starting to look at it. And I suppose because we've unpacked loads here, Kevin, but obviously what I do kind of want to mention as well, anybody that's tuning in is probably already aware that I'm a big fan of you guys over at Reveal, and I think you guys are approaching this challenge differently from kind of, we've referenced some of the more legacy kind of applications, or even just the approaches. I mean, could you just kind of give us a bit of a high level of how is it that you guys are maybe attacking this in a slightly different way that's actually resolving some of the problems that we've talked about?
Yeah. So we have to wake up every day and be very focused on the problem that we're solving, because, we're you can't solve every problem, right? And especially when you're, we're a startup, right? So we've got to be nimble and we've got to be great at what we do, and be very focused. And so, as you mentioned, and we've mentioned throughout this time talking, this is a really broad subject, and I don't think there's any one, thing that can solve this, right? So we think about what is our unique thing that we can help with, and what can we obsess about every day. And for us, it's what happens after the login to an application. So we're not trying to solve what happens before that. There's great companies that do that, and you should definitely be using them. And and I think for years and years, I don't know, maybe that's too big of a word. A lot of organizations just sort of relied on the prevention. That I'm gonna put in multi-factor authentication, single sign-on, and I'm gonna have tools that sort of prevent on the authorization, as in the authorization process, sort of protect that. And now I think it's a yes, that's great. We need to be doing that, but also I think we have to, like all the other elements of cybersecurity, all the other areas where we generally think prevent everything you can, you should do that. You should also have the mindset that you can't prevent everything. And if that's true, then you're going to have to be able to detect the things that you can't prevent and be able to mitigate the impact of that as fast as humanly possible, or as fast as machine possible. And so for whatever reason, sort of there's a gap. We saw a gap there with the identity, which is almost everything was sort of pointing at prevent everything you can. And then what about, like, okay, do we believe that there's a world where that people might get through that? And then what then happens? Can we detect once once the identity has the token? Can we detect? It's a very hard problem to solve, because it's one in which another sort of legacy remnant is, we tend to do things based on in cybersecurity based on things that we've seen in the past. We can sort of capture call them indicators. And then we tend to write rules around them and put them in a SIM or something. Put them, hey, if you ever see this again, flag it to me, kind of thing. So if you ever see this thing, whatever it is, IP address or whatever. Here, when we start talking about identity and we start talking about, okay, this identity logs in all the time, does stuff all the time, and is logging in now, doing the stuff it does all the time, but now it's malicious, right? That is really hard for indicators to they can be helpful after the fact, but in terms of like, how do I be more preemptive around that? You're kind of have to getting into looking at the way that identity is behaving, right? And behavior can become a very noisy place, and that's the last thing we need as defenders and operators, which is like a whole bunch more false positives, right? So what we said is that that's a huge problem. Like, how do we solve that problem for the defender? And what happens after login? What happens after the token's given to the identity and the identity is now logging into the application, and they may be there to do good and great, and we love them, and they may be there to do harm. And how do we figure that out? And how do we do that in a way that doesn't create a flood of false positives for the defender who can't deal with the current flood they have already on all the other stuff? And so that's the problem we wake up every day thinking about and working on, and we'll probably be doing that to the end of time.
No, honestly, I think you guys are doing some really exciting things, but like we've unpacked in this episode, it's definitely a big need in the market and something that we're going to continuously see evolve over the next kind of months and years. I think it's something that's just going to come more and more, I suppose, important. It's probably just the simplest way to explain it. But I mean, Kevin, this has been such a valuable conversation. Thank you so much for joining me here and shedding light on
Katie.
I think this is honestly one of the biggest blind spots in security for sure. So to our listeners, as always, don't forget to subscribe. Make sure to share this episode with your security peers. Get connected with us on LinkedIn, and of course, get connected with Kevin and the team on LinkedIn. But that's it for today. So thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you for more conversations shaping cyber.
Awesome. Thank you so much.